From Vermont Public, this is The Frequency. I'm Mary Angish, filling in for Mitch Whitley. It's Friday, January 26th, and here are today's headlines. Vermont is one of 17 states that decided not to apply for a new federal program that would have delivered $3.6 million in food benefits to low-income families this summer. But state officials now say they're trying to get a waiver from the federal government so Vermont can participate after all. Miranda Gray with the Department for Children and Families says her team has been meeting with representatives from the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
So we've taken that opportunity to be able to get more technical assistance, more time with the USDA to see what path forward, there might be.
Gray says Vermont initially decided not to participate in the summer EBT program because of the costs to the state to administer the program. But she says Vermont is trying to get a waiver that would prevent it from having to do labor-intensive data collection. Nearly 5,000 acres of forest in the northern Green Mountains has been permanently conserved and protected from development. Located along the north and west-facing slopes of the Greens, the two parcels of land in Richford and Jay are part of a 10,000-acre stretch of unfragmented forest between Vermont and Quebec. Much of the land is boreal forest, a habitat that is particularly threatened by climate change. And it also includes the headwaters of Stanhope Brook, the water supply for Richford. Eve Frankel leads the Nature Conservancy in Vermont, which partnered with Northeast Wilderness Trust and Vermont Land Trust on the project.
So being able to have these forested corridors allows species to shift their ranges with the warming climate.
Roughly half of the land will be protected from logging under a so-called Forever Wild easement. John Leibowitz is with the Northeast Wilderness Trust.
You can look at an old forest as a bank. There's a lot of carbon already stored there, and the best thing that we can do for our climate is to leave those trees standing where they are.
The land will be open to the public for skiing, hiking, hunting, and non-motorized recreation. And speaking of climate change, a new study from Dartmouth shows global warming has shrunk snowpack in the northern hemisphere over the last 40 years. Justin Mankin was one of the researchers on the study, which focused on snowpack loss in river basins. He says New England has been particularly affected, with a lot of river basins losing 10% or more of their snowpack per decade.
Global warming has already pushed a lot of river basins in New England into this situation, this regime where just a little bit of global warming is enough to take an even larger chunk out of the snowpack that's left.
The effects of snow loss are varied, from poorer skiing conditions in the winter to less snowmelt in the spring. And that could mean big changes for freshwater availability, something the researchers said needs more study in the Northeast. And in case you missed it, earlier this week, Vermont senators failed to override Governor Phil Scott's June veto of a bill that would have expanded the state's bottle redemption system. Earlier this month, state representatives easily cleared the two-thirds majority needed to override the governor's veto, but the Senate failed to do the same. The 17-13 vote means that the state's 5-cent per bottle redemption system will remain limited to beer, wine coolers, and carbonated drinks. That's according to 7 Days. The bill would have added a 5-cent deposit to a variety of other beverage containers, including hard cider, coffee, sports drinks, juices, and waters. Coming up, imagining grief as an elephant that gets smaller and smaller. That's after this.
Support for The Frequency comes from the Vermont Department of Liquor and Lottery, who manages Vermont's 802 Spirits liquor stores and contributes 100% of profits to the general fund, providing over $300 million to help benefit local communities.
Grief is a difficult emotion for any of us to deal with at any age. But it can be especially troublesome for children who may be encountering the feeling for the first time due to the loss of a loved one. If it was easy for adults to explain, we wouldn't need children's books like Grief is an Elephant, published in the fall by Richmond author Tamara Ellis Smith. In the book, Smith depicts grief arriving first as the large animal of the title, but morphing over time into other, smaller, familiar creatures, like a mouse. Smith joined Mitch Whitley to share more about the book.
What prompted you to write a children's book about such a difficult topic and emotion as grief?
Actually, the first version of this book was not about grief at all. It was an idea that I was working on called Waiting is an Elephant. And I was exploring the different ways that we wait. So, for instance, the difference between waiting in your bed the night before your birthday and waiting in the, reception area of the dentist before you get a cavity filled.
Some very different feelings going on there. Yes.
Yeah, and I thought, okay, there's something here I can play with. And I played with it for a very long time, and it just wasn't coming together. And then a friend of mine died, and then shortly after that, a friend of my son's died, and instantly, Grief is an Elephant came out of me into this new and right version.
Why did you choose to depict grief, especially as it first appears, perhaps to a child, as being like an elephant?
That initial feeling is heavy. It's like a place on your chest that's being pressed in and you can't breathe very well. And so that it just felt like the appropriate animal.
And you have to be careful with this, I imagine. You're writing a children's book, so kids are going to be reading this. You don't want the elephant, as depicted in the book, to be scary.
Right.
And it's not in this book.
No, it's not. And this is where my illustrator, Nancy Whitesides, comes in. She's an animal activist, animal fanatic, animal lover, and she especially loves elephants. And so she tried to depict this elephant with love as well as sadness. Love is the reason we feel grief. And so Nancy wanted to make sure that that was apparent. Nancy has the elephant tucking her trunk under her own ear. This is what elephants do when they're sad. She wanted to bring those layers and those truths into the story.
The pictures are soft-toned. They're friendly in their animal depictions throughout the book, not just the elephant. Really quite lovely. I think that your writing style matches her illustrated style. There's a wonderful complementary blend there. You write, sometimes grief is an elephant. You might hear her heavy pancake circle feet, or she might take you by surprise. I love that expression, her heavy pancake circle feet. It's so poetic.
Thank you.
And, you continue the animal metaphor throughout the book. What happens after grief first appears as an elephant? What's the next progression?
The grief moves from an elephant to a mule deer to a fennec fox and then a mouse. A big-eared mouse is the technical name of that mouse. Mm-hmm. And the through line are those ears. All of these animals, even though they become smaller and smaller and smaller, they all have the ears ready to listen when this little girl is ready to speak.
It's important to note, too, that there is not a simple linear kind of resolution to grief.
Right.
There's a passage where you allow for the fact that grief may wane over time, but it can also return.
Right.
And perhaps at unexpected moments. And there's a passage where you write, when grief comes back, she's a fox. Maybe offer her your hand. Then touch the tip of her nose. Touch her small feet. They've traveled so many miles, but they still feel soft like corduroy. What were you trying to get across with that particular section, that phrase there?
This little girl is finally turning toward grief and approaching her with some curiosity. I keep seeing you. I can't get away from you. I think I have, but then you show up again. I think I'm understanding now that I'm going to have to make friends with you.
Engage with you in some way.
I'm going to have to engage with you. Yeah. And so that's what I'm trying to show. Whereas at the very beginning, it's viscerally so scary and heavy. And then, yes, you want to run as far away as you can from it, and you might think you can. But in this moment, you finally come in the process to this maybe acceptance. I think curiosity is really the best way to describe it.
I want to mention, too, for parents who may be thinking about this book and, maybe a little put off by the subject matter, you don't mention death in this book. That word does not show up. It does not appear. It's implied. but it's not finding its way into the narrative in those starker terms. How were you able to do that? Was that tricky?
I felt like grief casts its shadow over more things. You know, you can grieve a house that you move away from, a neighborhood that you move away from.
Even a friendship that you
Absolutely.
lose, a bad breakup, anything like that.
Absolutely. There's
different levels and degrees of grief.
Yeah, and so I felt like I didn't have to specify, that could be a choice for the reader or the child listener.
I mentioned in the lead that grief dwindles down to the size of a mouse, but I forgot about the firefly.
Yes.
It's so small, but the glow is still there.
And also, they come and go, right? From night to day, but even in the moment you're looking at them, you see them, you don't see them. You see them, you don't see them. And I felt like that was an apt visual. My father died as I was editing this book. And the book became a way for me to process or even start to process the grief that I felt about losing him. That firefly helps me, and I hope that firefly helps everyone else who reads the story.
That was Richmond author Tamara Ellis Smith speaking to host Mitch Wertlieb about her children's book, Grief is an Elephant. Thanks for listening to The Frequency today. We had additional reporting from Peter Hirschfeld, Abigail Giles, and Nathaniel Wilson. Our executive producer is Kevin Trevelyan, and our music is by Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Mary Engish. Talk to you next week.
Every episode of Brave Little State begins with a question about Vermont that's been submitted and voted on by listeners like you. What happened to all the restaurant workers? What's the deal with Vermont's fire towers? Why do people like the band Fish? Follow Brave Little State wherever you get podcasts. From Vermont Public, part of the NPR network.